January 17, 1991. In the northern Persian Gulf, a cruiser called USS Bunker Hill opens her vertical launch cells and sends the first Tomahawk of Desert Storm climbing into the night. Bunker Hill was not built for this. She was an Aegis cruiser, engineered across a decade of Cold War anxiety to stop Soviet saturation missile swarms in the gray waters of the North Atlantic. Her radar, her combat system, her entire reason for existing pointed north, toward a fleet that never sailed. Instead, her first shot in anger flies into an Iraqi desert. Every ship about to enter this war carried the same contradiction. Battleships reactivated to kill Soviet cruisers. Carriers designed to hunt long-range bombers. Submarines built to stalk ballistic missile boats beneath the Arctic ice. All of them now crammed into a shallow, mine-infested gulf, defacing a third-rate navy. The question is simple. How did Reagan's Blue Water Fleet perform when forced into the exact environment it was never meant to fight in? And which of its designs survived the translation? The oldest combatants in the coalition fleet were also the most improbable. USS Missouri and USS Wisconsin had been laid down during the Second World War, fought across the Pacific, then been put into mothballs for decades. In the 1980s, Navy Secretary John Lehman pulled them back out. His 600-ship Navy needed surface action groups capable of confronting Soviet Kirov-class battlecruisers, and the old Iowas still had armor no modern hull could match. Their 1980s modernization bolted the future onto the past. 32 Tomahawk cruise missiles in armored box launchers, 16 Harpoon anti-ship missiles. Modern radars and electronic warfare suites installed alongside 9 16-inch guns that still threw 2,700-pound shells across 20 miles of ocean. In January 1991, both battleships fired Tomahawks in the opening salvos of the war. Then they turned inshore and did what only they could do. Hundreds of 16-inch rounds fell on Iraqi artillery positions, coastal bunkers, and troop concentrations along the Kuwaiti shoreline. On February 17th, Missouri struck a mine, absorbed the damage with her armored hull, and kept firing. These were the final battleship combat actions in human history. The Cold War had kept them alive just long enough to end on that note. USS Midway was commissioned 1 week after Japan surrendered. By 1991, she had been modernized across 4 decades into something her original designers would not have recognized. Her flight deck was still too short for the F-14 Tomcat or the S-3 Viking, the aircraft that defined the newer supercarriers. So her air wing was custom-built around the limitations. 3 squadrons of F/A 18 Hornets, paired with A-6 Intruders, formed a compact strike-optimized package designed to fit the ship rather than the other way around. In Desert Storm, Midway served as the flagship of Battle Force Zulu in the Persian Gulf itself, operating in the cramped, mine-threatened waters where newer supercarriers were initially reluctant to venture. Carrier Air Wing 5 launched the first naval strikes of the war. Her aircraft executed the first combat use of the Walleye 2 guided bomb, putting precision munitions through Iraqi command bunkers. The irony was sharp. A ship conceived to fight Japanese kamikazes had ended her career delivering laser-era ordnance from the tightest waters of a desert war. If a 46-year-old carrier could still dominate, the question became what the newer supercarriers were doing and why some of them were kept farther from the fight. 3 generations of American supercarriers fought this war simultaneously. USS Saratoga and USS Ranger belonged to the Forrestal class, commissioned in the late 1950s as the first U.S. carriers designed from the keel up for jet operations. Saratoga served as flagship of Battle Force Yankee in the Red Sea, and her embarked squadron VFA-81 scored the Navy's first air-to-air kills of the war, downing 2 Iraqi MiG-21s on the opening night. USS America and USS John F. Kennedy represented the Kitty Hawk class, improved 1960s designs that launched strikes from the Red Sea throughout the campaign. Kennedy's A-7 Corsair squadrons flew the final combat missions ever conducted by the aircraft before its retirement. And then there was USS Theodore Roosevelt, a Nimitz-class nuclear carrier commissioned in 1986, the newest capital ship in the fleet. Nuclear propulsion gave her unlimited endurance and the highest sortie rates of any carrier in theater. 3 decades of carrier architecture operated side by side, each generation executing exactly what its era's designers had intended. But every one of them shared the same vulnerability. And the real threat to these billion-dollar ships was not Iraqi aircraft. It was something much cheaper, sitting just below the waterline. The Ticonderoga-class cruisers were the crown jewels of the Reagan buildup. Their Spy-1 phased array radars, their Aegis combat systems, and their Mark 41 vertical launch cells had been engineered for one nightmare above all others: the Soviet saturation missile attack designed to overwhelm fleet defenses. In Desert Storm, the technology found a different use. USS Bunker Hill opened the naval war by firing the first surface-launched Tomahawks ever used in combat. Across the fleet, Ticonderoga-class cruisers launched dozens more, tracked Iraqi Scud ballistic missiles, and coordinated integrated air defense across entire battle formations. Then the contradiction arrived. On February 18th, USS Princeton, one of the most sophisticated warships ever built, struck an Iraqi influence mine laid by a converted fishing vessel. The blast cracked her superstructure and damaged her hull. Princeton did not withdraw. She continued coordinating air defense from a crippled ship. The Cold War had produced a fleet optimized for ranged high-technology engagements against a peer adversary. Iraq fought that fleet with a weapon whose basic principle predated the American Civil War. This moment is the hinge of the entire naval story of the war. Step back from individual hulls, and the structural mismatch becomes impossible to miss. The Cold War Navy had been built for the Norwegian Sea, the GYUK Gap, the open reaches of the Pacific. Deep water, long sight lines, a peer adversary fought at range. The Persian Gulf offered none of those conditions. At its worst, the Gulf is barely 300 feet deep, choked with shoals, oil platforms, and dense civilian fishing traffic. Iraq laid more than 1,300 naval mines across approaches the coalition had to use. The casualties came within hours of each other. Princeton struck her mine on February 18th. That same morning, the amphibious assault ship USS Tripoli hit another. Missouri was very nearly struck by an Iraqi Silkworm anti-ship missile, saved only by the British destroyer HMS Gloucester and her Sea Dart missile system. Every high-end American asset was suddenly operating inside the threat envelope of weapons that cost less than a single Tomahawk. The Reagan buildup had won the war, but the Gulf had rewritten the requirements for every ship class that would follow. The Los Angeles-class attack submarines had been designed for one environment above all others: the deep ocean under the Arctic ice, on hunting Soviet ballistic missile submarines in the acoustic silence beneath the pack. In Desert Storm, USS Pittsburgh, USS Louisville, and USS Chicago fired the first submarine-launched Tomahawk cruise missiles ever used in combat. Their targets were in the desert. No Iraqi submarines existed to hunt. The boat's acoustic stealth, refined across 20 years of Cold War competition, was repurposed for covert cruise missile launch. The shallow waters of the Gulf made that stealth less protective than it had been anywhere their designers had imagined, yet the boats pressed in regardless. The deeper shift was quiet but permanent. The American submarine force had pivoted from anti-submarine warfare to land attack in the middle of a war, and that pivot would define every submarine deployment for the next 30 years. A Cold War platform had outlived its enemy and found a new reason to exist. The war's most consequential ships were not the glamorous ones. The Spruance-class destroyers had been designed in the 1970s as anti-submarine escorts for carrier battle groups expected to chase Soviet boats across the North Atlantic. In Desert Storm, they fired roughly 40% of every Tomahawk cruise missile launched in the war. A class built to hunt submarines had become the single largest strike contributor in the fleet. Their vertical launch cells, their 5-inch guns, their embarked helicopters, all of it repurposed for a mission nobody had planned for when the hulls were laid down. Alongside them worked the Oliver Hazard Perry-class frigates, the low-end ships Congress had nearly canceled for being too cheap, too simple, too unambitious. In the Gulf, the Perrys conducted maritime embargo enforcement, boarded Iraqi vessels, and carried out helicopter operations across the theater. USS Nicholas launched raids on Iraqi-occupied oil platforms and captured the first prisoners of the war. The Cold War had produced a two-tier fleet, expensive high-end assets built for the apocalypse and cheap escorts built for everything else. In Desert Storm, both tiers earned their budgets. The cheap ships simply did it without making headlines. The Reagan-era fleet had been conceived for a war that never happened. The Gulf became the only arena where its entire architecture, from reactivated 1940s battleships to brand-new Aegis cruisers, operated together in real combat. The verdict was mixed in ways that mattered. Blue water supremacy was confirmed beyond dispute. Our precision strike warfare was validated and became permanent. But literal vulnerability had been exposed in ways Cold War planners had never modeled. Mines, shore-launched anti-ship missiles, and the threat of swarming small craft had bloodied ships that had been designed to survive Soviet regimental missile attacks in the open ocean. The consequences reached forward across decades. The damage to Princeton and Tripoli drove the next generation of American mine countermeasures. The lessons of those 6 weeks shaped the littoral combat ship program and influenced successive flights of the Arleigh Burke-class destroyers that followed. The Cold War Navy won a war it was never built for, and in winning it, the fleet wrote the terms of its own obsolescence. Every American warship designed and built since has been, in some measure, a response to those 6 weeks in the Persian Gulf in 1991.